I'm Diana, 32, and my heart still aches thinking about my mom's empty rocking chair on our porch. When she died last year, I inherited our family home and thought I'd have a place to preserve her memory. But my mother-in-law, Margaret, saw it differently. She swooped in and transformed our home as if I didn't exist, while my husband, James, stood by silently. I cried myself to sleep for months until one day James finally found his voice and everything changed. Before I share my story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like and subscribe button and stay with me for a journey that might help you stand up for yourself too. Growing up in the small town of Maplewood, it was always just Mom and me against the world. Sarah Thompson raised me single-handedly after my father abandoned us when I was just 3 years old. I barely remember him, but the void he left was filled completely by my mother's unwavering love and dedication. Mom worked multiple jobs to keep a roof over our heads and food on the table. During the day, she was a receptionist at the local clinic, and evenings were spent waitressing at Rosie's Diner downtown. Sometimes on weekends, she'd pick up cleaning jobs at the wealthy homes on Hillcrest Avenue. Despite her exhaustion, she never complained. "This house is our fortress," she'd tell me, looking proudly at our modest 2-bedroom home with its slightly crooked front porch and faded blue shutters. Our Sunday brunches were sacred. No matter how tired she was from her Saturday night shift, Mom would wake up early to make her famous blueberry pancakes and scrambled eggs. We'd sit at our small kitchen table with its vintage yellow surface and talk about everything and nothing. During these moments, I felt like the richest girl in the world. Holiday decorating was another tradition we cherished. We couldn't afford fancy ornaments, so we made our own. Every December, we'd spend evenings crafting paper stars, popcorn garlands, and salt dough ornaments painted in bright colors. Our Christmas tree never made it to the glossy pages of magazines, but to me, it was the most beautiful sight in the world. When college acceptance letters arrived, Mom cried tears of joy. "You're breaking the cycle, Diana," she said, hugging me tightly. Despite being accepted to several prestigious universities, I chose State College just an hour away. The scholarship covered most expenses, but Mom insisted on helping with books and supplies. She picked up even more shifts, sometimes working 16 hours straight. During those college years, I'd come home every other weekend. Mom would have my favorite beef stew waiting the house spotlessly clean despite her brutal work schedule. Those weekends watching old movies together on our sagging couch remain some of my most treasured memories. It was Mom who inspired me to become an elementary school teacher. "You have such patience with children," she observed after watching me tutor the neighbors' kids. "You'd make a wonderful teacher." Her faith in me never wavered, even when I doubted myself through challenging education courses and demanding student teaching placements. When I met James during my junior year, Mom was cautiously supportive. "He seems like a good man," she said after their first meeting, "but make sure he respects your independence." As our relationship grew serious, she welcomed him into our small family circle, teaching him our traditions and sharing embarrassing childhood stories that made me blush. At our wedding, Mom wore a simple blue dress she had saved for months to buy. She danced with James after our first dance, whispering something in his ear that made him nod solemnly. Later, he told me she had asked him to promise to always protect my heart as carefully as she had. 2 years into our marriage, Mom started forgetting things. Keys, misplaced appointments, missed recipes, suddenly forgotten, mid-preparation. The diagnosis came like a thunderbolt: aggressive brain cancer with a prognosis of months, not years. Those final months were a blur of hospital visits, medication schedules, and watching my vibrant mother slowly fade away. Through it all, she worried more about me than herself. "The house will be yours," she insisted during a rare lucid moment. "It's not much, but it's paid for. You'll always have a safe place to land." In her final week, I took leave from my teaching position and moved into her room at Shady Grove Hospice Center. I read her favorite Jane Austen novels aloud, played Ella Fitzgerald records, and held her increasingly frail hand. James visited daily, bringing fresh flowers and sitting quietly with us. "Take care of each other," she whispered the night before she passed. "And promise me you'll plant sunflowers next spring. They always bring the butterflies." I promised through my tears, clutching her hand as she drifted to sleep. Mom passed peacefully the next morning as the sun streamed through the window. I was holding her hand, telling her about the classroom garden my students had planted. I like to think she heard me, that she knew she wasn't alone in her final moments. The grief hit in waves, sometimes receding enough to let me breathe, other times threatening to drown me completely. Having her house. Our house became my anchor. Every corner held memories, the kitchen where she taught me to bake, the living room where we built blanket forts during thunderstorms, the backyard where she helped me practice for field day races. In those first raw months of grief, those memories were both painful and healing. James suggested we move from our apartment into Mom's house. "It's bigger than our place, and it would save us rent," he said practically. But I knew the real reason was to keep me connected to Mom. For that understanding, I loved him even more. James Peterson entered my life during a comparative literature class in our junior year of college. Tall, with kind brown eyes and an easy smile, he stood out not just for his looks, but for his thoughtfulness. While other students rushed out when class ended, James stayed to help the elderly professor gather her scattered notes. That small act of kindness caught my attention more than any flirtation could have. Our first conversation happened in the campus coffee shop. I was struggling with a particularly challenging paper on Victorian literature when he approached my table. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, "but I noticed you in Professor Wilson's class. That paper's a beast, isn't it?" His smile was warm, without a trace of the arrogance I'd come to expect from the handsome guys on campus. Unlike me, James came from considerable wealth. His father, Robert Peterson, owned Peterson Real Estate Development, one of the largest property development companies in the state. They lived in an imposing colonial house in Westridge, the affluent neighborhood where Mom sometimes cleaned houses. The irony wasn't lost on me, though. James never made me feel less than his equal. Our worlds couldn't have been more different. While I worked part-time at the library to supplement my scholarship, James drove a new BMW his parents had given him for his 21st birthday. When I mentioned taking the bus to visit Mom, he insisted on driving me, never making me feel like a charity case. I met his mother, Margaret Peterson, 3 months into our relationship during a dinner at their home. The Peterson residence was intimidating: marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and furniture that looked too perfect to actually use. Margaret greeted me with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "So, you're the girl James has been spending all his time with," she said, looking me over from head to toe. Margaret was impeccably dressed in a cashmere sweater and pearls, her ash blonde hair styled in a perfect bob. Everything about her screamed old money and careful breeding. Throughout dinner, she asked pointed questions about my background and future plans, each inquiry feeling like a subtle test I was failing. "Teaching is such a noble profession," she said, with a smile that suggested nobility was a poor substitute for ambition. Though I always hoped James would marry someone who could help with the family business. The implication was clear: I wasn't what she had envisioned for her only son. James's relationship with Margaret was complicated. He clearly loved his mother, but there was an underlying tension I couldn't quite understand. He rarely contradicted her directly, preferring to change the subject or find compromises that wouldn't upset her. When I asked about it later, he shrugged it off. "Mom's just protective," he explained. "She'll warm up to you eventually." Robert James's father was more welcoming. A self-made man who had built his business from scratch, he seemed to appreciate my work ethic and independence. "Reminds me of my own mother," he told James within my earshot. "Strong women make the best partners." Margaret's tight smile at this comment spoke volumes. As our relationship progressed, James's pattern of yielding to his mother became more evident. Whether it was changing dinner plans to accommodate Margaret's sudden desire to see us, or altering vacation arrangements because she thought our original destination wasn't suitable, James consistently chose the path of least resistance. Our engagement announcement brought Margaret's controlling nature into sharper focus. She immediately took charge of wedding planning, presenting her ideas as decisions already made. When I expressed a preference for a small, intimate ceremony, Margaret dismissed it as charming but impractical. According to her, James's position as heir to the Peterson fortune required a certain type of wedding, one with hundreds of guests and society photographers. James, caught between his mother's expectations and my wishes, tried to please everyone. "Maybe we can compromise," he suggested. "Keep the ceremony small, but have a larger reception." It was the first of many compromises that favored Margaret's vision over ours. Our wedding, held at the prestigious Westridge Country Club, was beautiful, but barely recognizable as the celebration I had envisioned. I wore the dress Margaret had selected instead of my mother's restored gown. We served champagne I couldn't pronounce instead of local wine from my hometown vineyard. The only element that truly felt like us was the moment we said our vows, looking into each other's eyes and promising forever. After graduation, James joined his father's company as expected. The position came with a substantial salary and the promise of eventual leadership, but also with strings attached. Company events, client dinners, and family obligations controlled much of our schedule. Each time I expressed frustration, James reminded me of our financial security. "Dad's grooming me to take over," he'd say. "We have to play by their rules for now." I tried to build relationships with James's family despite the class differences that Margaret seemed determined to highlight. I brought homemade dishes to family dinners, only to have them relegated to the kitchen while Margaret's catered spread took center stage. I offered to help plan holiday gatherings, only to be given the most menial tasks. Each rejection stung, but James never noticed, or if he did, he chose not to address it. As Robert's health began to decline from heart problems, Margaret became even more demanding of James's time and attention. Sunday brunches, once our private tradition, became family meetings about the business. Vacations were canceled for emergency consultations. Our life increasingly revolved around the Peterson family orbit. Despite these challenges, James and I dreamed of starting our own family. We talked about having children, about raising them with values from both our backgrounds. "I want our kids to have your compassion and Mom's work ethic," James would say, holding me close. "And I want to raise them in a real home, not some sterile showcase." When Mom left me her house, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to establish our own space, our own traditions. James agreed enthusiastically, sketching renovation plans that preserved the home's character while updating its aging systems. "We'll keep your mother's garden," he promised, "and maybe add a nursery for when the time is right." For a brief moment, I believed we might finally step out from under Margaret's shadow and build something that was truly ours. The day after Mom's funeral, Mr. Winters, her attorney, asked James and me to come to his office. With his wire-rimmed glasses and gentle demeanor, Mr. Winters had been Mom's friend for decades, helping her draft a will despite her limited assets. "Sarah was very clear about her wishes," he explained, opening a thin folder. "The house on Maple Street, all its contents, and her savings account of $23,000 are to go to her daughter Diana." Even though Mom had told me her intentions, hearing it officially made her absence more real. I clutched James's hand as Mr. Winters continued, "She also left a letter for you, Diana." He handed me an envelope with Mom's distinctive handwriting. Later that night, sitting on Mom's bed, I read her final words to me. "My dearest Diana, if you're reading this, I've moved on to whatever comes next. Don't grieve too long, sweetheart. I've had a wonderful life, made perfect by being your mother. The house is yours now. It's not much compared to what some people have, but it was bought with honest work and filled with love. I hope it gives you and James a solid foundation for your future together. Remember what I always told you, a house becomes a home when it holds your heart. Fill these rooms with laughter with children, if you're blessed with them, with the same love that has sustained these walls for all these years. All my love, always, Mom. I traced her signature through my tears, feeling both her absence and her presence acutely in the faded wallpaper, the worn furniture, the garden visible through the window. James found me there, curled around her letter. He sat beside me, pulling me into his arms. "We'll honor her memory," he promised. "Make this place ours while keeping her spirit alive." In the following weeks, we began planning thoughtful renovations. The kitchen needed updating, the bathroom was stuck in the 1970s, and the electrical system required a complete overhaul. But we agreed to preserve the elements that made the house special: the hand-carved banister my grandfather had installed, the height markings on the kitchen doorframe, chronicling my growth, the stained glass window that cast rainbow patterns across the living room floor on sunny afternoons. We spent evenings sketching layouts, researching contractors, and discussing color schemes. James suggested opening up the small kitchen to create a more modern space, while I advocated for keeping Mom's vintage cabinets and restoring them. "We could paint them buttercream yellow," I suggested. "Mom always said it was like having sunshine indoors year-round." The first sign of trouble came 3 weeks after we'd moved in. I returned from school to find Margaret's silver Mercedes in our driveway. Inside, she was measuring the living room windows. "Oh, Diana," she said, barely glancing up. "I was just thinking these windows desperately need proper treatments. Those cotton curtains are letting in far too much light for any decent furniture." Before I could respond, she continued, "I've brought some fabric samples from my designer. James said you wouldn't mind if I helped spruce the place up a bit." I looked at James, who shrugged apologetically. "Mom offered to contribute to the renovations," he explained. "She has great taste, and we could use the help." That night, after Margaret left with promises to return with her interior designer, I confronted James. "This is supposed to be our project," I said. "Mom left this house to us to make our own decisions." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Diana, Mom's just trying to help. She's offering to pay for upgrades we couldn't otherwise afford. Besides, with Dad's health getting worse, she needs a distraction. Can't we just be grateful?" The mention of Robert's declining health made me pause. Over the past month, his heart condition had worsened, requiring more frequent hospital visits. James was already stressed, torn between work responsibilities, caring for his father, and our renovation project. Maybe accepting some help wasn't such a bad idea. 2 days later, Robert suffered a major heart attack. The next week was a blur of hospital visits, whispered consultations with doctors, and Margaret's controlled panic. "He needs peace and quiet to recover," she insisted. "The renovations will be too much stress for all of us." Before I fully understood what was happening, Margaret had suggested, and James had agreed, that we should temporarily move into the guest wing of the Peterson home while Robert recovered. "Just for a month or so," James promised. "The contractors can get more done if we're not underfoot anyway." Reluctantly, I packed essentials for a temporary stay, making James promise that all major decisions about the house would still be ours. "Of course," he assured me. "Mom's just helping with the logistics while we focus on Dad." Living in the Peterson mansion was like residing in a museum where I constantly feared breaking priceless exhibits. Margaret ran her household with military precision. Meals were served precisely on time. Cleaning staff appeared and disappeared like clockwork, and every surface gleamed with polish. Our assigned rooms were luxurious but impersonal, lacking the warmth and character of Mom's modest home. A week into our stay, Margaret mentioned casually over dinner that she had scheduled her designer to begin work on our house. "Nothing major," she said, noting my expression. "Just some basic updates to make it presentable. That old house needs a professional touch." "But we already had plans," I protested. "Specific ideas about what to change and what to preserve." Margaret patted my hand condescendingly. "Dear, that house needs far more than cosmetic changes. The structure itself requires work before you can even think about decorating. My team will handle the essentials." James, focused on his father's health and increasing work responsibilities, barely engaged with the conversation. "Mom knows about these things," he said distractedly. "Let's trust her judgment for now." As days turned into weeks, Margaret's visits to check on the renovation became more frequent, while my own access to the house became increasingly limited. "The contractors don't like interruptions," she explained when I mentioned wanting to see the progress. "Besides, I want it to be a surprise when it's finished." A knot of anxiety grew in my stomach as I realized how little control I had over what was happening to Mom's house. Our house. One afternoon, I drove by anyway, shocked to see a large dumpster in the driveway filled with what looked like original fixtures and materials. Through the windows, I could see walls had been removed, the entire layout altered from what we had planned. That evening, I showed James photos I'd taken on my phone. "This isn't what we discussed," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "They're gutting the place, not renovating it." James glanced at the photos distractedly. "It looks like progress to me," he said. "Mom says the place needed structural work we weren't aware of. The foundation had issues, apparently. And that required removing the built-in bookshelves my grandfather made, or tearing out the window seat where Mom and I used to read together." My voice cracked. James finally looked at me properly, his expression softening. "I'm sorry this is hard for you, but Mom means well. She's putting a lot of money into making the house better for our future. Try to see the big picture." As Robert's condition stabilized and he returned home under the care of a private nurse, I expected we would return to our house and take control of the renovations. Instead, Margaret announced that the project had evolved into a more extensive remodel that would take several more months. "It's going to be spectacular," she assured us. "A proper home worthy of a Peterson." In that moment, looking at her triumphant smile, I realized she never intended to honor our wishes or my mother's legacy. Margaret saw the house as another Peterson acquisition, not the cherished home it had always been to me. 3 months into the renovation, I drove to the house after school, determined to see the changes for myself, despite Margaret's discouragement. Using my key, which still worked, despite the new construction, I stepped into what had once been my childhood home and froze in shock. The interior was unrecognizable. The warm, slightly worn wooden floors had been replaced with cold marble tiles. The cozy living room, with its built-in bookshelves, was now an expansive great room with soaring ceilings and sterile white walls. Every trace of the original character had been systematically erased, replaced with Margaret's vision of modern luxury. I wandered through the transformed space in a daze, touching unfamiliar walls and staring at empty spots where treasured features had once stood. The kitchen, once the heart of the home with its yellow cabinets and breakfast nook, now featured sleek stainless steel appliances and stark white cabinetry that belonged in a showroom, not a family home. Upstairs, the changes were even more jarring. My old bedroom had been converted into a media room with built-in electronics and sound-dampening panels. Mom's bedroom, the space I'd most wanted to preserve, was completely gutted. The walls expanded to create what looked like a luxury master suite. In the backyard, a crew of landscapers was removing Mom's beloved perennial garden. The sunflowers she had planted each spring, the rose bushes we had tended together, the herb garden that had supplied our kitchen, all were being ripped out to make way for an elaborate pool and patio installation. "Excuse me, you can't be in here during construction." A decorator approached, clipboard in hand. Mrs. Peterson gave strict instructions about site visitors. "I'm Diana Peterson. This is my house," I replied, my voice shaking. Recognition dawned on her face. "Oh, Mrs. Peterson mentioned you might stop by. She asked me to tell you not to worry about any of your old things. She's had them carefully packed and stored in the garage." The garage. My mother's cherished possessions are family heirlooms and memories relegated to storage like unwanted junk. I walked numbly to the detached garage and slid open the door. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, some already showing damage from the dampness. I opened the nearest one to find Mom's collection of vinyl records, the edges of the cardboard covers warped from improper storage. Another box contained photo albums, the pages stuck together from moisture. I carefully separated a photograph of Mom and me at my college graduation, her proud smile now wrinkled and faded from neglect. The sight broke something inside me, and I sank to the concrete floor, clutching the damaged photo to my chest as sobs racked my body. That's where James found me an hour later, alerted by the decorator about my emotional state. Instead of the understanding I desperately needed, he seemed embarrassed and anxious to remove me from the property. "Diana, you shouldn't have come without telling someone," he said, helping me to my feet. "The contractors have liability concerns about visitors." "Visitors?" I repeated incredulously. "This is my house, James, my mother's house, and your mother is destroying everything that made it special." James sighed, the sound weighted with impatience rather than empathy. "Mom's investing over $200,000 in improvements. The property value will triple when she's done." "I don't care about property values. I care about preserving my mother's memory, our family history. Look at this." I thrust the damaged photograph toward him. "Your mother has thrown our past into boxes like garbage." "We can restore the photos," he said dismissively, "and we can find places for your mother's things in the new design. But Diana, be reasonable. That old furniture wouldn't work in the updated space. Mom's creating a showplace for us." "I never wanted a showplace. I wanted a home." My voice echoed in the garage, bouncing off boxes of discarded memories. James checked his watch, another habit he'd picked up from his father. "I have a meeting with Dad's doctors in an hour. Can we discuss this later? Maybe once you've calmed down a bit?" His condescending tone only fueled my anger. "Do you even hear yourself? You sound exactly like your mother." The comparison stung him, I could tell, but instead of addressing it, he retreated into practicality. "Let's go home. You're upset, and this isn't the time or place." Home. The Peterson mansion had never been and would never be home to me. But as James guided me to his car, I realized I no longer had anywhere else to go. My true home was being systematically erased, and my husband couldn't or wouldn't understand why that was devastating me. That night, James worked late, avoiding the conversation I desperately needed to have. It became a pattern over the following weeks. Whenever I tried to discuss the house, he found reasons to be elsewhere. Urgent meetings, appointments with his father's doctors, work emergencies that couldn't wait. The emotional distance between us grew alongside the physical transformation of my childhood home. I tried reaching out to Robert, hoping he might understand my position or influence Margaret to respect my wishes. I found him in his study, looking frailer than ever as he reviewed company documents. "Robert," I began hesitantly, "I wanted to talk to you about what's happening with my mother's house." He looked up, his eyes tired but kind. "Margaret mentioned she's helping with renovations. Very generous of her, isn't it?" "That's actually what I wanted to discuss. The changes being made aren't what James and I had planned. The house was supposed to remain a home, not become a showcase." Robert sighed, setting aside his papers. "Diana, I've been married to Margaret for 35 years. In all that time, I've learned one important lesson: Margaret always gets her way in the end. She has a vision for how things should be, and she'll move heaven and earth to make it happen." "But this isn't her house," I protested. "My mother left it to me." "And legally, it is yours," he agreed. "But practically speaking, Margaret has the resources and the determination to transform it according to her standards. James has never been able to stand up to his mother, and I'm afraid I haven't set a good example in that regard." His honesty surprised me. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know what you're up against." He picked up a pen, turning it in his fingers. "Margaret means well. She truly believes she's improving your situation, giving you and James a better life. The fact that it's not what you want doesn't register with her. It never has. So what am I supposed to do? Just watch as she erases every trace of my mother from the house that was her legacy to me. Robert looked at me with genuine sympathy. I wish I had better advice, Diana. But the truth is, in this family, Margaret's will prevails. Always has. The only question is how much of yourself you're willing to sacrifice in opposition. It wasn't the help I'd hoped for, but his candor gave me valuable insight. As I left his study, I realized I was truly alone in this battle against Margaret's domination. Even my husband had chosen his mother's vision over mine. The pattern continued for weeks, with Margaret making all decisions about the renovation while I was systematically excluded. James grew more distant, spending most evenings at the office and returning home late, often after I was already in bed. When we did speak, conversations were superficial, avoiding the growing rift between us. My principal at school, noticing my increasing distraction and emotional fragility, called me into her office one afternoon. "Diana, your students adore you, and you're one of our strongest teachers," she said gently. "But lately, your mind seems elsewhere. Is everything all right?" The simple kindness in her question broke through the protective wall I'd built. Before I could stop myself, I was sobbing the whole story, pouring out Mom's death, the inherited house, Margaret's takeover, James's betrayal through silence. Throughout my breakdown, the principal listened without judgment, passing tissues and nodding with understanding. When I finally fell silent, exhausted from the emotional release, she leaned forward. "Diana, I'm going to suggest something as your friend, not just your supervisor. Take some personal time. We can arrange a substitute for 2 weeks. Use that time to decide what you truly want and what you're willing to fight for." Her compassionate suggestion was the lifeline I needed. The next day, I began my leave of absence, using the daytime hours when the Peterson house was empty to really think about my marriage, my future, and what Mom would advise if she were still here. "Stand up for yourself," I could almost hear her say. "Your happiness matters too." I spent my first day of leave sitting in a coffee shop downtown, away from both the Peterson mansion and my childhood home. The distance helped clear my mind, allowing me to see patterns I'd been too close to recognize. James's constant deference to his mother wasn't new. It had been present from the beginning of our relationship. I had simply believed marriage would shift his primary loyalty to me. Instead, the pressure of his father's illness and increased work responsibilities had pushed him further into Margaret's controlling orbit. The second revelation was harder to accept. I had been complicit in my own erasure. Little by little, I had yielded to avoid conflict, retreating into silence rather than demanding to be heard. My mother had raised me to be stronger than that. By the end of the week, I had resolved to take a more active role in reclaiming both my house and my voice in my marriage. The opportunity came sooner than expected when Margaret announced a neighborhood garden tour featuring her new landscape design. "We've been invited to showcase the renovated property next month," she announced during dinner. "The West Ridge Garden Club is quite selective about which homes they include. It's quite an honor." "The garden club wants to see our house," I asked, emphasizing the possessive. "The one where my mother's garden used to be." Margaret waved dismissively. "That old cottage garden was charming in its way, but hardly showcase material. The new design with the infinity pool and structured plantings is much more suitable." The garden club president was quite impressed with the preliminary photos. Something inside me snapped. After weeks of silent suffering, I couldn't contain my outrage any longer. "You had no right to destroy my mother's garden. That house and everything in it belongs to me, not you." Margaret's expression hardened. "James, please explain to your wife that we've invested considerable resources into improving that outdated property. Her emotional attachment to what was essentially a rundown house is becoming tiresome." Before James could speak, I continued. "I'm going to the house tomorrow to check on my mother's belongings. There are specific items that should have been preserved." If you're referring to those old trinkets and garage sale furniture, Margaret replied coolly. Most of it wasn't worth saving. My decorators had to make executive decisions about what to keep. My heart froze. What do you mean, what to keep? Where are my mother's things? James finally entered the conversation, his tone cautious. Diana, some items were in poor condition. Mom's team sorted through everything and kept what could be incorporated into the new design. And the rest? I demanded. Donated or disposed of, depending on the condition, Margaret answered. Really, Diana, most of it wasn't even vintage, just old. We've replaced it with quality pieces that befit James's position. The room spun around me as the full impact of her words sank in. They had thrown away my mother's possessions, her legacy, our family history. My mother's wedding ring, I whispered. It was in her jewelry box in the bedroom. Margaret and James exchanged glances. I'm sure it's been safely stored, James offered unconvincingly. No. I stood up my chair, scraping loudly against the floor. You don't understand. That ring was the only thing she had from her own mother. It's irreplaceable. Diana, you're being dramatic, Margaret said. If this ring was so valuable, you should have secured it before renovations began. Valuable, I repeated incredulously. It's not about monetary value. It's about family history, about connection, about respect for what matters to me. Lower your voice, Margaret hissed. This behavior is exactly why we've had to make decisions without you. You're too emotional to be practical. I turned to James, desperately searching his face for any sign of support. James, please, tell her this has gone too far. His eyes darted between his mother and me, conflict evident in his expression. But when he spoke, his words were a knife to my heart. Diana, Mom's right. You're not thinking rationally about this. The improvements to the house are for our benefit, for our future children. Future children? I laughed bitterly. You think I'd raise children in a house where their grandmother's memory has been completely erased, where their father can't even stand up for their mother's feelings? Margaret's eyes narrowed. I think that's quite enough. James, perhaps Diana needs time to compose herself. This display is inappropriate and ungrateful. Ungrateful! I was nearly shouting now. For what? For destroying everything that mattered to me, for treating me like an inconvenient accessory to your son's life? Tell me, Margaret, what exactly should I be grateful for? The dining room fell silent. Robert, who had been quietly eating throughout the confrontation, looked uncomfortable but said nothing. James stared at his plate, avoiding eye contact. Margaret stood her posture rigid with controlled anger. I think we're finished with dinner. Diana, when you're ready to apologize for this outburst, we can discuss how to move forward appropriately. As she left the room, James finally looked up at me, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. Did you have to do that? You know how she gets when challenged. In that moment, seeing his concern for his mother's feelings rather than mine, something broke inside me. Without a word, I left the dining room and went upstairs to our suite. With mechanical efficiency, I packed a small bag with essentials clothes for a few days, toiletries, my laptop, and the few mementos from Mom I'd kept with me rather than leaving at the house. James found me zipping the bag closed. What are you doing? He asked, alarm finally registering in his voice. Leaving, I replied simply. I can't stay here anymore. Diana, you're overreacting. Where would you even go? Anywhere that isn't here. I shouldered my bag and moved toward the door. I need space to think about whether this marriage is still working for me. That got his attention. He stepped between me and the door, his expression suddenly concerned. You don't mean that. We're just going through a rough patch with Dad's health and the renovation stress. This isn't about the renovation, James. It's about you consistently choosing your mother over me. It's about watching silently while she dismantles my mother's legacy piece by piece. It's about you being unable or unwilling to stand up for what matters to me. That's not fair, he protested weakly. I've been trying to balance everyone's needs. I looked at him directly. No, you haven't. You've been taking the path of least resistance, which always means giving your mother what she wants. I've tried to be understanding to compromise, but this has gone too far. I need you to decide once and for all who you want to build a life with. You're giving me an ultimatum. His tone hardened. I'm asking you to make a choice that you should have made years ago. I love you, James, but I won't be erased from my own life to make your mother comfortable. I moved past him toward the door, half expecting him to stop me to promise things would change. Instead, he stood there silently as I walked away, his inaction speaking volumes about his priorities. I drove to the Westbrook Hotel, checking in for the night without any clear plan beyond escaping the suffocating atmosphere of the Peterson household. In the anonymous quiet of the hotel room, I finally allowed myself to fully feel the grief and anger I'd been suppressing for months. The next morning, I called Amy Wilson, a fellow teacher and friend who had offered support during my mother's illness. When I explained my situation, she immediately offered her spare room for as long as I needed it. No questions asked, she promised. Just a safe space while you figure things out. That afternoon, I met with Elaine Donovan, a family law attorney recommended by Amy. I'm not sure if I'm heading for divorce, I explained, but I need to understand my options regarding the house my mother left me. Elaine listened carefully to the full story, taking notes and asking occasional clarifying questions. When I finished, she looked up from her legal pad. Legally, your position is quite strong. The house was left to you in your mother's will, making it your separate property, not marital property. The fact that renovations have been made doesn't change ownership, though it does complicate things financially. What do you mean? If your mother-in-law has invested significant funds in renovating your property, she could potentially claim she's entitled to compensation for those improvements. However, since these renovations were made without your explicit consent and against your expressed wishes, her claim would be weakened considerably. So the house is still legally mine? Absolutely, and you have every right to determine who can access it. If you wanted to, you could serve notice requiring your mother-in-law and her contractors to vacate the property immediately. The knowledge that I still had legal control over my mother's house gave me a sense of power I hadn't felt in months. I wasn't powerless in this situation. I had simply allowed myself to be silenced. Armed with this information and temporary housing at Amy's, I began reconstructing my sense of self apart from the Peterson family influence. I returned to teaching, finding solace in the classroom routine and the uncomplicated affection of my students. In the evenings, Amy and I would share dinner, her straightforward companionship a refreshing change from the constant tension of the Peterson household. James called daily at first, his messages veering between apologies and justifications. Mom's upset about how you left, or Dad's health is declining again, I could really use your support. Each attempt to draw me back into the family dynamic without addressing the core issues confirmed I had made the right choice in stepping away. After 3 days of separation, I drafted a formal notice with Elaine's help requiring Margaret and her contractors to cease work on my property pending resolution of our dispute. I had it delivered to both the house and the Peterson residence, making my legal stance clear. The response was immediate. Margaret called, her voice tight with controlled fury. This is completely unnecessary and embarrassing for all of us. James is devastated by your behavior. Is he? Then he should call me himself. I hung up before she could respond. An hour later, James appeared at the elementary school, waiting by my car after dismissal. He looked haggard, with shadows under his eyes, and his usually impeccable clothes slightly rumpled. The sight stirred complicated emotions, concern, lingering affection, but also a new wariness. "We need to talk," he said simply. James stood beside my car, hands shoved in his pockets, looking more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him. The confident businessman persona had cracked, revealing the uncertain man beneath. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the weight of our separation hanging between us like an invisible barrier. "Can we go somewhere?" he finally asked. "Not the house, just somewhere we can talk privately." I nodded, unlocking my car. "There's a park nearby. We can walk and talk." The small community park was mostly empty on a weekday afternoon. We found a bench overlooking the duck pond, sitting with careful distance between us. James stared at the water for a long moment before speaking. "I've barely slept since you left," he began. "I keep replaying our arguments, everything that's happened with the house with Mom, and I realized something I should have seen years ago." He turned to face me fully. "I've been a coward, Diana. All my life I've taken the path of least resistance with my mother, because standing up to her was just too hard." The admission startled me. In all our years together, James had never acknowledged his pattern of yielding to Margaret so directly. "Why?" I asked simply. "Why is it so difficult to contradict her?" James sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "You have to understand what it was like growing up with her. From my earliest memories, Mom controlled everything in our house. What I wore, who my friends were, which activities were appropriate for a Peterson. Dad was always working building the business, so Mom shaped my daily life. That doesn't explain why you still can't say no to her as an adult," I pointed out. "It's not that simple," he continued. "Mom has this way of punishing disapproval, not physically but emotionally. If I chose something she didn't approve of, the atmosphere at home would become unbearable. Cold silence, pointed comments bringing up past disappointments. And if I held my ground, she'd eventually target whoever had influenced me away from her vision." A chill ran through me as I recognized the pattern. Margaret hadn't just been controlling the house renovation. She'd been systematically isolating me, making James choose between his mother's approval and his wife's happiness. "When I was 16, James continued, I wanted to try out for the school musical instead of debate team. Mom said performing was for people who couldn't achieve real success. When I did it anyway, she told all her friends I was going through a phase due to the unfortunate influence of my drama teacher. She even tried to get the teacher transferred to another school." "Did she succeed?" James shook his head. "No, but she made that teacher's life miserable with complaints and scrutiny until I quit the musical to make it stop. That's when I learned it was easier to just go along, to convince myself her way was probably best anyway." "And that's what you've been doing with our house?" I said quietly. "Convincing yourself her vision is better than preserving my mother's home." "Yes." The simple admission hung in the air between us. "But something changed when you left. For 3 days, I've had to face what my life has become without you in it. And I realized I don't like who I am when I'm just an extension of my mother's will." A pair of mallards skimmed across the pond's surface, creating ripples that expanded outward in perfect circles. "What changed, James? Why now, after all this time?" "I went to see Dad yesterday to talk about you leaving. I expected him to take Mom's side, to tell me you were being unreasonable. Instead, he said something that hit me like a thunderbolt. 'If you don't find your voice now, son, you'll lose the only person who truly wants you to have one.'" I stayed silent, letting him continue. "He told me that his biggest regret was never standing up to Mom when it really mattered, that he watched her steamroll over people's feelings for decades, because confronting her seemed harder than just keeping the peace. And then he said, 'Don't wake up 30 years from now realizing you sacrificed your chance at real happiness for temporary comfort.'" James's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I love you, Diana, more than I've been showing you lately. And I hate what's happened to your mother's house, to your memories, to us. I hate that I've been too weak to stop it." What about Margaret? I asked. She's not going to simply step back and let us reclaim the house. I know. James straightened his shoulders, a determination I hadn't seen in years hardening his features. That's why I want us to confront her together. I've arranged a meeting at the house tomorrow morning. Mom and Dad will both be there. The prospect of facing Margaret with her renovations still underway filled me with anxiety. And if she refuses to acknowledge what she's done, if she continues to dismiss my feelings, then we make it clear that her relationship with us moving forward depends on her respecting our boundaries, including you as my wife and equal partner, not some inconvenient addition to the Peterson family. His words sounded right, but years of watching him yield to Margaret made me cautious. James, I want to believe you, but I've watched you make promises before, only to retreat when confronted with your mother's disapproval. I know I've failed you, he acknowledged, reaching tentatively for my hand. I'm asking for a chance to prove I can change, that I can be the husband you deserve, not just with words, but with actions. I looked at his outstretched hand, weighing years of love against months of betrayal through silence. The earnestness in his eyes made me want to believe him, but the wound was still too raw for complete trust. I'll come to the meeting, I finally said, not taking his hand. But I need you to understand something. This isn't just about the house anymore. It's about whether you're capable of being an equal partner who values my feelings and history as much as your family's expectations. I won't go back to being invisible in my own life. He nodded solemnly. I understand. And Diana, I found your mother's ring. It was in one of the boxes in storage. I've kept it safe. A weight lifted from my chest at his words. Mom's ring, the tangible connection to generations of women in my family, wasn't lost after all. Thank you, I whispered finally, allowing myself to accept the olive branch he was offering. We agreed to meet at the house the following morning. As I watched James walk back to his car, his posture straighter than when he'd arrived, I felt a cautious hope flutter in my chest. Whether it would survive confrontation with Margaret remained to be seen. That night, at Amy's apartment, I barely slept rehearsing what I wanted to say to Margaret, imagining different scenarios and outcomes. By morning, I was exhausted, but resolute. This meeting would determine not just the fate of the house, but of my marriage as well. I arrived at the house first, using my key to enter what had once been my childhood home. The renovation was nearly complete, the interior transformed into a showcase straight from a luxury magazine. Standing in what had been Mom's cozy living room, now an expansive space with imported marble and custom furniture, I felt like a visitor in a stranger's home. James arrived next, carrying a small velvet box I assumed contained Mom's ring. He looked as tired as I felt, but greeted me with determination rather than his recent uncertainty. They'll be here soon, he said. Mom wanted to bring her decorator to explain the vision, but I told her this was a family matter only. The confidence in his voice gave me hope that perhaps he truly was ready to stand his ground. We walked through the transformed house together, James seeing for the first time how completely his mother had erased the home's original character. I didn't realize how drastic the changes were, he admitted, stopping in the kitchen that now resembled a sterile showroom. Mom always described it as updating and preserving the best elements. This isn't an update, it's a complete erasure. That was always her intention, I said quietly. To replace my history with her vision. The sound of a car in the driveway interrupted our conversation. Through the window, I could see Margaret emerging from her Mercedes, Robert following more slowly with the aid of a cane. The moment of confrontation had arrived. Margaret entered without knocking, as if the house were already hers. She wore an impeccably tailored suit, her expression a mask of controlled civility. Diana, I see James convinced you to be reasonable. I'm glad we can put this unpleasantness behind us and move forward as a family. Her presumption that my presence indicated surrender ignited my resolve. Before I could respond, however, James stepped forward. Mom, Dad, thank you for coming. There's something important we need to discuss." The steadiness in his voice surprised me. "This renovation has gone in a direction Diana and I never approved, and it needs to change." Margaret's smile faltered. "James, everything has been done to the highest standards. The property value has increased tremendously. Diana should be thanking me, not complaining." "This isn't about property values," James countered, moving to stand beside me. "This house was Diana's childhood home, her mother's legacy. The renovations have erased every trace of that history without her consent." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "I see she's filled your head with dramatic exaggerations. Really, James, I expected better judgment from you." "Stop." James's voice was quiet but firm. "This isn't Diana manipulating me. This is me finally seeing clearly what you've been doing, not just with the house, but with our marriage. You've been systematically pushing Diana aside, treating her as an intruder rather than my wife." Robert, who had been silently observing, spoke up. "Margaret, perhaps we should listen to what they want. The house legally belongs to Diana after all." "I've invested hundreds of thousands in improvements," Margaret protested. "This place was falling apart before I stepped in." "No, it wasn't," I interjected. "It was a well-loved home with character and history. Everything you've changed was done without my consent and against my expressed wishes." Margaret turned to me, her expression coldly dismissive. "Your sentimental attachment to outdated fixtures and amateur gardening is hardly a basis for sound property decisions. James needs a home that reflects his position in society." "What James needs," he interrupted, his voice stronger than I'd ever heard it, "is a marriage based on mutual respect. What he needs is a mother who recognizes his wife as an equal, not a threat. What he doesn't need is someone else deciding what his home should look like without consulting him or his wife." The room fell silent. Margaret stared at her son as if seeing a stranger. "James, I don't understand why you're suddenly speaking to me this way. Everything I've done has been for your benefit." "No, Mom. It's been for your benefit to maintain your control over my life. And I've allowed it because confronting you was harder than sacrificing Diana's happiness. That ends today." I watched in astonishment as James continued laying out boundaries clearly and firmly. He explained that we would be taking control of the renovation, keeping some changes, but restoring elements important to my family history. He made it clear that future involvement in our lives would require respect for both of us as a couple, with no more attempts to undermine me. Throughout his speech, Margaret's expressions cycled through disbelief, anger, and finally, a calculating assessment. When James finished, she turned to Robert. "Are you going to allow him to speak to me this way?" Robert surprised us all by slowly standing, leaning on his cane for support. "Our son is a grown man making reasonable requests about his own marriage and home. Yes, Margaret, I am going to allow it. In fact, I'm going to support it." Margaret's composure cracked slightly. "Robert, after all these years, you're taking their side against me." "This isn't about sides, Margaret. It's about recognizing that our son deserves the chance to build his own life with the woman he loves without our constant interference. I've watched you steamroll over Diana, just as you've steamrolled over others who didn't fit your vision. I stayed silent too long because it was easier than fighting. James is showing more courage than I ever did." The words seemed to hit Margaret like physical blows. For perhaps the first time in her life, she faced a united front of resistance from the men she had controlled for decades. Her eyes darted between Robert and James, searching for the weakness she could exploit, finding none. "I see," she said, finally gathering her designer purse. "So this is how family loyalty is repaid, with ingratitude and rebellion." "No, Mom," James said gently. "This is how family is properly defined. Diana is my family too, my chosen family, and it's time you accepted that." Margaret turned abruptly and walked out the door without another word. Robert lingered, looking exhausted, but somehow lighter. "She'll come around eventually," he told us. "Margaret has many flaws, but she does love you, James. Once she realizes her relationship with you is at stake, she'll adapt. In her own way, on her own timeline." After Robert left to join Margaret in the car, James and I stood in silence for a moment, absorbing what had just happened. Finally, he turned to me, opening the velvet box in his hand to reveal Mom's simple gold wedding band. "I promised I'd keep this safe," he said, offering it to me. "Just like I'm promising now to be the partner you deserve, to stand with you against anyone who tries to diminish what matters to you." I took the ring, feeling its familiar weight in my palm. "This is a beginning," I said cautiously. "We have a lot to rebuild, not just the house." "I know." James reached for my hand, enfolding it and the ring in his warm grasp. "But I'm ready to do that work every day for as long as it takes." In that moment, standing in the house that would become ours again through intention and effort, I chose to believe him. The 6 months that followed our confrontation with Margaret were challenging, but transformative for our marriage and our home. True to his word, James took an active role in reclaiming the house from his mother's vision, working alongside me to find a balance between the modern improvements and preserving Mom's legacy. The first step was dismissing Margaret's decorators and contractors, replacing them with professionals who understood our goal of honoring the home's original character. While we couldn't undo all the structural changes Margaret had implemented, we could modify the interior to reflect our personal taste rather than her showcase aesthetic. "What if we use these built-ins for your mother's book collection?" James suggested as we reassessed the living room. "And maybe we could incorporate some of her furniture in the family room rather than these museum pieces Mom selected." His enthusiasm for restoring elements meaningful to me proved his commitment wasn't just momentary rebellion against his mother. Each decision we made together strengthened our partnership and healed some of the damage from the previous months. The backyard became our most significant restoration project. Though Margaret's crew had removed Mom's perennial garden, many of the plants had been carelessly discarded rather than properly disposed of. Amy's husband, Brian, a landscape designer, helped us salvage root systems and transplant what could be saved. "Your mom planted these with care," Brian observed as we carefully replanted a rose bush that had somehow survived. The soil amendments, the positioning for proper drainage, she really knew what she was doing. "She learned from her mother, who grew up on a farm," I explained, feeling a connection to Mom as my hands worked the same soil hers had. Gardening was how they bonded after my grandmother moved to the city. While we couldn't restore the garden exactly as it had been, we created a new design that incorporated salvaged plants alongside fresh additions. The centerpiece became a memorial garden dedicated to Mom, featuring her favorite sunflowers and a small stone bench inscribed with her favorite saying, "Bloom where you're planted." Inside the house, we carefully unpacked the boxes Margaret had relegated to the garage, discovering many treasures that had survived her purge. Photos were reframed and displayed prominently on walls that had briefly showcased Margaret's preferred abstract art. Mom's vintage kitchen table, slightly scratched but sturdy, replaced the sleek designer piece that had never felt right for family meals. James surprised me one weekend by installing shelves in the home office to display Mom's collection of vintage teacups, each with its own story from her travels and adventures. "I remember the blue one," he said, carefully placing a delicate porcelain cup with hand-painted flowers. "She told me she found it at a flea market the day you took your first steps." His attention to these details, memories I hadn't even realized he'd retained, showed me a side of James I'd feared was lost beneath years of his mother's influence. The man I'd fallen in love with was re-emerging stronger and more autonomous than before. Margaret's response to our changes evolved gradually. Initial fury gave way to wounded silence as she declined invitations to see the renovations. Robert visited occasionally, offering cautious support and updates on Margaret's adjustment to her diminished influence. "She's talking about redecorating our own house," he reported with a wry smile. I suspect she needs a project where she can exercise full control. Give her time. Her pride won't let her stay away forever. James maintained contact with his parents, but established clear boundaries about their involvement in our decisions. When Margaret attempted to reinsert herself by sending housewarming gifts that matched her original vision, James returned them with a polite but firm note, explaining that we were making our own choices. His consistency impressed me most. The old James would have wavered after a few weeks of Margaret's disapproval, finding ways to accommodate her demands while asking me to understand. This new James remained steadfast, prioritizing our marriage, even when it meant continuing conflict with his mother. "How do you do it?" I asked one evening as we sat on the porch swing we'd installed as a nod to the one from my childhood. "Stand up to her consistently when it was so difficult before." James considered the question seriously. "I think of what's at stake. Before, avoiding her disapproval seemed like the highest priority. Now I understand that building a life with you on our terms matters more than temporary peace. And honestly, it gets easier with practice." My return to teaching full-time coincided with the completion of our major renovations. My students noticed the change in my demeanor immediately, with one particularly perceptive third grader observing, "Mrs. Peterson, you're smiling with your eyes again." The comment made me realize how profoundly the house situation had affected me, how much of myself I'd lost during those months of feeling powerless. Reclaiming the house had helped me reclaim my sense of self and agency. The healing extended to our marriage as well. The distance that had grown between James and me gradually closed as we worked together, making decisions as true partners. Evening conversations that had become perfunctory during the renovation crisis evolved into meaningful exchanges again, rebuilding the emotional intimacy we'd nearly lost. 4 months after the confrontation, Margaret finally accepted an invitation to dinner at our home. Her visit was tense, but civil, her eyes cataloging every change we'd made to her grand design. I watched her notice the family photos back on display, Mom's quilts draped over furniture, the herbs growing in kitchen window boxes. "It's homey," she offered finally, the word clearly a compromise from whatever criticism she'd initially planned. "That's exactly what we wanted," James replied, his arm around my shoulders. "A home, not a showcase." The evening didn't magically resolve years of conflict, but it marked a turning point. Margaret began to accept, if not fully embrace, the new dynamic. Her visits remained infrequent, but the open hostility gradually subsided. Robert later confided that she had begun seeing a therapist, at his insistence working through her control issues for perhaps the first time in her life. 6 months after reclaiming our home, I missed my period. The home pregnancy test confirmed what I'd begun to suspect: we were expecting our first child. The timing felt right, our marriage stronger than ever, and our home finally feeling like the secure haven Mom had intended it to be. When I shared the news with James, his joy was tempered with thoughtful reflection. "I want to be the kind of parent your mother was," he said, holding me close. "Present, supportive, teaching values that matter, not my mother's approach of control and appearance management." "You will be," I assured him, believing it completely. The man who had found his voice to defend our home and marriage would find his way as a father too. We held a small housewarming party to share our news with close friends and family. Amy and Brian, who had supported us through the difficult months, were first on the guest list. Robert came looking healthier than he had in years, the stress of mediating between Margaret and the rest of the world apparently lifting. Margaret attended too, bringing a surprisingly thoughtful gift: a garden stepping stone embedded with morning glory seeds that would bloom in spring. "For your memorial garden," she explained awkwardly. "The nursery said they were pollinator-friendly." It was a small gesture, but the fact that she had asked about appropriate plants for Mom's garden rather than imposing her own preference signaled a willingness to try. Progress would come in these small moments, I realized, not in dramatic transformations. As our friends celebrated with us, I slipped away briefly to Mom's garden, now blooming with late summer flowers. Sitting on the memorial bench, I felt her presence more strongly than I had since losing her. "We did it, Mom," I whispered to the evening air. "We preserved your legacy, not just in the house, but in the values you taught me. Standing up for myself, fighting for what matters, building a life with room for both memories and new beginnings." The breeze rustled through the sunflowers, their faces turned toward the setting sun, just as they had been in Mom's original garden. In that moment, I understood the most important lesson from our ordeal. True strength isn't about controlling others or imposing your will. It's about knowing what matters to you and having the courage to protect it, even against those who claim to know better. James found me there a few minutes later, sitting beside me in comfortable silence before asking what I was thinking. "About what I want to pass on to our child," I answered honestly. "Not just this house or material things, but the understanding that home is wherever you're truly seen and valued. That's what Mom gave me, what we've fought to rebuild here. And what we'll give our child," he promised, his hand resting gently on my still flat stomach. "A home where their voice matters, where they're never invisible." In the months and years that followed, we kept that promise. The house continued to evolve, accommodating a nursery and eventually a playroom, but always maintaining the balance between honoring the past and creating space for new memories. Margaret gradually adjusted to her role as grandmother rather than director, finding joy in a relationship built on mutual respect rather than control. The journey from grief to reclaiming my voice taught me that standing up for yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary for authentic relationships. By finding his voice, James hadn't just saved our marriage. He'd discovered a more genuine way of being in the world. Together, we'd transformed a house back into a home and a marriage of convenience back into a true partnership. So, if you're feeling invisible in your own life, if someone is erasing what matters to you, remember that your voice matters. Standing up for yourself might be difficult, but the alternative, slowly disappearing, is far more painful in the long run. What relationships in your life might need more honest boundaries? Where might you need to find your voice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe if this story resonated with you. Remember, we all deserve to be seen and valued, especially by those who claim to love us. Thank you for listening, and until next time, take care of your heart and your boundaries.